Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to inform you of great theories of everything and other things that are way off the beaten path that you probably never heard of, but if you had, they could change your entire life. And we've been doing a lot of Bible decodes, especially from the New Testament, that follows the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That meaning that the New Testament was written by the Romans, in particular by the Caesars, and in more particular by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. That is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, who lived in, or who ruled Rome from 69 until 96 AD. And they, according to the theory, wrote the New Testament, or parts of it at least, the Gospels at least. And they backdated the story by up to about 40 years, maybe more, to the early 30s AD. Jesus had his ministry from 30 to 33 AD in Judea. And at the same time that they wrote the Gospels, they also wrote a 7-volume work that was called War of the Jews. And this is a history that was written about the war between the Romans and the Jews that occurred from 66 to 73 AD. And the protagonists in that story are the Flavian emperors, before they became emperors, when they were still military generals fighting to put down the Jewish revolt in Jerusalem and the rest of Judea. And so General Vespasian was called in by Nero after the revolt in 66 AD. He was there for about 3.5 years until he became the new emperor. And when he did, he appointed his son Titus to be the new military commander in Judea. And he had a 3-year ministry in Judea from 70 to 73 AD. And if you study War of the Jews, War of the Jews was written under the name of Josephus. And so Josephus may or may not have existed, but everybody believes that he did. But according to his autobiography, he was a member of the Flavians, known as Flavius Josephus. He was an adopted member of Vespasian's family. Originally, he was a Jew and one of the military commanders in Galilee for the Jews, but he surrendered to Vespasian, and upon doing so, he defected to the Romans and predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor. When Vespasian did become emperor, he hooked up Josephus, pardoned him, brought him to Rome to be one of the court historians, gave him a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. No doubt that Josephus's War of the Jews was issued by the Roman Caesars with a great endorsement from Titus. And so if you read War of the Jews, the parallels between it and the New Testament are uncanny and cannot be dismissed. Joseph Atwill, in his book Caesar's Messiah, first detailed many of the parallels between Jesus' 3-year ministry in Judea and Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea. In War of the Jews, it discusses all of Titus's adventures, the battles that he fought, the challenges that he faced, the people that he met, the places that he went. And every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. in the same order. And every event or consequence that Titus undergoes, a parallel event Jesus undergoes. So not the same thing, but a conceptually parallel event. And the events are always set off by exactly 40 years. So in other words, the ministry of Jesus is a copy of the history of Titus's military campaign as set out in War of the Jews. Moreover, many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled literally in the story of the history of the War of the Jews, including at least a dozen of them fulfilled by Titus. Titus, therefore, is the second coming of Jesus, and was known as such by many of the ancient Christians or older Christians. Many sects have had War of the Jews as part of their biblical canon. And even today, the preterists still have Josephus as part of their biblical canon. Now, we're looking in particular at a new book that's come out by Michael Menasgotz, Menasgotz, which is called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. So he's right down this same line of thinking, but what he does is he looks into the book of Luke and looks for parallels between Luke and the War of the Jews. He found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. That's over 10 per chapter. That is one out of every 4.6 verses, there's a new parallel. And many of the parallels last for several verses. Meaning that parallels between the book of Luke and War of the Jews thoroughly saturate the book of Luke. Not only that, but he graphs the parallels on a chart with the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every time he finds a parallel, he puts a point at the place of the corresponding location. And lo and behold, after plotting the 250 plus parallels, he has created 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars. So not only did the Romans write the New Testament, but they signed their name to it. Or at least the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Menasgotz goes over all of these parallels in this book. We've covered most of them. Right now he's gotten into, we're toward the end of the book, and right now we've gotten into some slightly more speculative material, but interesting stuff. If you look at the APTVS pattern on the thumbnail, you can, those are the 5 Latin letters, APTVS. The TVS would obviously be Titus Vespasian. The AP may stand for Agia Pneuma, Pneuma with a silent P. That means Holy Spirit, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That would be the second son, Domitian. Or it could be possibly a team, whoever Josephus was. Which I would say, according to other scholars, including Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, that would be a guy named Arius Piso and his family. Menasgotz is not quite as convinced of that as I am, but he's going to get into some more. If you look at the thumbnail, you can see that the A and the P and to some extent the T are not nearly as well developed as the V and the S. The V and the S was most likely written first by Vespasian, and there's a lot more detail there, and the parallels there are much richer, much more well put together. Now, you have to understand that these parallels are works of genius, evil genius, and the tenor of the parallels are ruthless mockery and mean-spirited ridiculing, with a touch of cannibalism, murderous pedophilia, and gay pornography. So this is, and the Roman Caesars were literally the most demented people that have ever lived, on the planet, just about. These are the people that wrote your Gospels. And if you wake up to it, you can recognize that is very obvious if you read War of the Jews. Now we'll get into a little bit of Menasgotz's discussion here and see where he goes. Contrasting with this, in my 5th article, I provide evidence that Jesus' story conceptually mirrors that of Samson. Now, it's also true that Jesus' story mirrors that of Moses. Right there at the very beginning of Matthew, there are 7 to 10 commonalities between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus. But here he's talking about Samson. The story conceptually mirrors that of Samson in over 40 ways. And he's gone, I don't remember him going over that. It's been a while. But despite Samson's story being just 50 sentences long, 40 parallels in 50 sentences. If there's 1 or 2 of them, you can dismiss them as being coincidental. But when there's 40 of them in 50 sentences, it's really, even if they're weak parallels, you still have to regard them as being intentional. Okay, and this was probably done to help equate Jesus with a sun god, since the divinely strong Samson can be shown to be a Jewish analog of a sun deity myth, and indeed an analog of the strong man Hercules, or indeed to help Jews see their existing hero figure evoked in Jesus' story. Putting all these facets of information together, perhaps the emperor, originally Vespasian, albeit with the role then passing to his son Titus, had intended to be worshipped as a sun god via multiple religious traditions in order to draw in commoners of as many faiths as possible. Yeah, well, so now you have to recognize that in the Roman Empire, they had hundreds of nations under their empire, and each one of them had a different religion. Most of them were polytheistic. That's why they had so many difficulties with the Jews, is because they had this jealous and zealous monotheistic God who insisted on a bunch of quirky, idiosyncratic rituals to satisfy his addictions to animals and burning animal flesh, and his OCD and hypochondria for all of the the sanitary rituals, the kosher and the food laws and the sanitary laws. And so the Jews were willing to fight for those to maintain those rituals. And so that's why the Romans wrote about Jesus, because they knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, but the Messiah that they were waiting for was a military commander. And indeed, there were really three people like that were involved in this revolt in 66 AD. According to War of the Jews, their names were Eleazar, Simon, and John. And they all rose up and they kicked out the Herod kings and caused Emperor Nero to have to bring in Vespasian, General Vespasian. And so instead, the Romans wrote a story about a Roman Messiah, a Jewish Messiah, who was a Prince of Peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, and believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel. And so, at the same time, while he's overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers outside the temple, and disrupting the commerce of the Jewish vendors who are selling pigeons and doves to satisfy the gods' addictions inside the temple. So Jesus is taking a direct hit at the Jews and their rituals, while at being utterly deferential to the Romans. Other circumstantial evidence, which you don't even need, because these parallels state the case so perfectly. But what the other red flags are, why is this New Testament written in Greek? That's the language that's spoken and written in Rome, not so much in Judea. Now, the Roman Caesars also spoke and wrote in Latin, but it was mainly Greek in Rome. And the Romans also had complete censorship authority. Nothing was being published in Rome unless it met Caesar's standards. And the Romans had a monopoly on publishing, having thousands of slave scribes to copy texts over and over again all day long. And they had a monopoly on the postal service, on distribution. There's no, you could say that, your choices are, the Gospels came out because the Romans orchestrated the whole thing and used it as part of a psychological operation of which they were masters, and they had created a number of religions already. Titus created 2 other religions, and Vespasian at least one. So it's not like this is way far off in terms of speculation. So your choices are either the Romans orchestrated this whole thing or God did it. So which one do you think it is? If you ask Occam, he will tell you. You never want to make a supernatural explanation when there are perfectly natural explanations that would explain it just as well or better. Okay, putting all of these maybe neither Vespasian nor Titus greatly cared which Roman god the commoners would worship them as, just as long as they worshipped him and his family, thereby cementing their hold on the throne, preventing uprisings, keeping the legions loyal, and ensuring people paid their taxes. And that's another point about Christianity, is it's a good religion because it's a limited hangout. The Romans had to put a lot of good stuff in there to convince people. So they put a lot of Roman stoicism, cynicism, and a lot of Platonic philosophy, along with a lot of mythology and other pagan beliefs, stuff like baptism, which maybe would be Hillel, Judaism. And the Romans wanted the Jews to be good citizens who, worked hard and obeyed the law and paid their taxes. That's what they wanted you to be. So it's not like it created this religion to turn you into a bunch of degenerates, but they created it for you to be a good citizen. So obviously there's plenty of good stuff in the Bible, in the New Testament. But if you know how to read it, you can see that you're being mocked with it. So, question, is there more to be discussed regarding the APTVS signature, and should we expect it to be mentioned in Luke? I will come back to whether Luke talks about the APTVS pattern and start by considering whether the two versions of Jewish war might contain hidden references to the APTVS signature. It is fairly well known that some scholars claim that passages of War of the Jews that overtly refer to Jesus' story must have been added in later centuries by Christian apologists. There are some difficulties with this, namely, why would Christians add references to Jesus that don't reflect what Christians think? How did they end up in all surviving copies of Jewish War, and why does the Slavonic version of Jewish War also have so-called additions, yet different ones? Admittedly, they do have reason to think this. Firstly, since the overt references to Jesus' story in Jewish War do indeed look like they were forcibly inserted into an otherwise coherent narrative. And secondly, because later Christian apologists clearly knew of Jewish war, yet failed to mention that it talks of Jesus. Well, nowadays, when you talk to Christians, they almost instinctively will give you the name of Josephus as corroborating evidence for the existence of Jesus. But if you actually open the book, Jewish War, and read Josephus, you will, especially if you look at his autobiography, you can see that the existence of the writings of Josephus is very, very strong evidence against the existence of Jesus. However, once we realize that the original first century author of Jewish War was busily inserting references to Jesus' story at the precise locations needed to create the APTVS pattern, we don't have to imagine this being done a few centuries later. And once we realize that this APTVS pattern was potentially fatal to Constantine's decision to use Christianity to rule Europe, it is obvious why such Christian apologists would avoid attracting attention to it. So, having shown that these supposed additions referencing Jesus' story were added right at the outset, I will now show how at least one of them appears to be talking about the APTVS pattern. In the shorter version of War of the Jews, known as the Slavonic Josephus, it is one of these supposedly added passages that retells Jesus' nativity and how the astronomers followed the star to Bethlehem. However, it describes this not as a star, but rather as a star image. And indeed, it talks of a message of the stars. In doing so, it seems to reinforce our hypothesis that the APTVS signature intentionally evokes stars of the sky being rearranged to spell out God's names, or God's initials. Despite generally shorter paragraphs and a few missing ones, the Slavonic version appears to retain the information that enables us to plot parallels with Luke to enable the APTVS pattern to be presented. Before I describe how Jewish War retells the star image leading Herod's astronomers to baby Jesus, I'll mention that plotting things in two-dimensional charts was already a known technique by the 1st century AD, with the key example being Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC, who plotted the stars using a 2D coordinate system, and whose teachings relate to and build on that of the Chaldeans. This point about Chaldeans is significant because when talking about star image, Jewish War also talks about the Chaldeans. And if it helps demonstrate their significance, so does the book of Acts. Now, this section is called War of the Jews, Slavonic version, Book 1, Chapter 20, Paragraph 4. The section retelling Jesus' nativity story by the Leeming translation. We begin with this short excerpt. If the reader is interested, the full text can be purchased from Brill.com, or for a tenth of the price, just the chapter with the translation. Okay, let's turn the page and pray that this goes well, because sometimes it doesn't. At least I found the right page. Now I just have to focus it in. Okay. Herod's astrologers said, now this is, I believe, a quote from War of the Jews. Herod's astrologers said, "Our fathers and children have been excellent astrologers, watching the stars, and we too have never distorted the message of the stars. The star image appeared to us signifying the birth of a king." And the story continues, describing how the star appeared 3 times, disappearing each time. They told Herod, "King, we are sons of Persia. Astronomy, which is our science and craft." These are the magi, the 3 magi. "We are sons of Persia. Astronomy, which is our science and craft, our ancestors took over from the Chaldeans." Notice that while in the Gospels the Magi follow a star to find baby Jesus, in this version it is a star image. What could a star image be other than a constellation of stars forming a shape? Also, the way Herod's astronomers mention the Chaldeans gives us a link with Hipparchus and his introduction of plotting things in 2D on star charts, which is what the APTVS pattern appears to be intended as. So he says, the astronomers, I believe this is also from War of the Jews. There's a footnote there, but I don't. It doesn't address the source, or he said it was book 1, chapter 20, I believe. So maybe that's where it is. The astronomers continued talking, telling Herod that, yeah, that makes sense, because in book 1, there's an incredible amount of attention paid to the life of King Herod, which is way, way, way before, the War of the Jews. King Herod, I believe, took over in like 37 BC. So the astronomers continued talking, telling Herod that as we gazed upon the stars, we have never been wrong, and a star of ineffable beauty appeared to us, separated from all the other stars. The star was not one of the 7 planets. So in Roman times, the planets were thought of as stars, which explains why the author needed to rule them out. And not one of the spearmen swordmen or archers, nor a comet, but brilliant like the sun. Now, he says, having already ruled the planets out, why would it be necessary to rule out that the star was a spearman, swordman, or archer, since those are found in the characters of the constellations? In view of this, it seems the author is very subtly ruling in the possibility that this star image is actually a constellation. So nor a comet, but brilliant like the sun, a possible reference to Jesus, who appeared transfigured with his face shining like the sun in Matthew 17:2. Herod said, "Can you show it to me?" And they said, "We reckon the whole world sees it." And he asks, is this suggesting that this great APTVS constellation is supposed to span 360 degrees around the heavens? And when Herod saw it, he marveled and worshipped God. And he asked his priests if any understand the meaning of that star. And they said, "It is written." Okay, so here in this Roman version of the Nativity story, Herod is told there is a star image that he cannot see, which the astronomers will follow to find baby Jesus. And they talk about it in ways implying it might be a constellation. Herod responds by asking about the meaning of that star, which again suggests that this is a metaphor for the APTVS star image pattern. The astronomers' description of the star image appearing or disappearing tallies with the idea that this new God lives in the stars as a constellation. A common Roman idea, for example, the god of Hercules, who exists in the sky as the constellation Hercules, but comes down to earth temporarily in the form of Jesus and Titus, such that Titus should be seen as a god, literally residing in the heavens or firmament among the stars. This would align with what John 1 tells us about shining logos, that is a word and an image, and also God's name, namely that it isn't just the word of God, but is also actually God himself. And now he goes to the hints in Luke, but I believe we're about out of time, so we'll check that out later. Like, share, subscribe. Come back tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.